Okay, today I want to talk about a couple of things that are going to help you and your own code and helping other developers to work with your code. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about ES6 modules and how to use destructuring as part of your calls to your functions. So the starter code, everything that I've got on the screen right now, if you look down in the description, you'll find the link to the code gist with all the files. The file structure is just this. I've got a CSS folder and a JavaScript folder. The 3 JavaScript files are inside the JS folder. The 1 CSS file is inside of here. And at the root, we've got the index.html file. Okay, so jumping in here to look and see what we've got. We have this page with 3 form elements. I've got an email field, a password field, a drop-down list for a language selection, just some sort of login or register page. And when I click send, what I want to do is I want to take this data, bundle it up, do some validation, and if it's all good, send it off to the server. Now, I'm not going to actually write the scripts for the validation, but I've got placeholders for that. So we can see what would work, what would happen if it did or didn't validate. Okay, so down here at the bottom, in my HTML file, I've got a script tag, my main.js file. This is my main one. And because I've put type equals module inside of here, it means that I'm able to use ES6 modules. I can now do import and export because my one main starter script has type module. So inside of main.js, I can do imports. So I can bring in my user file. I can bring in my errors file. The errors file, I've just defined a couple of custom error classes. So I'm creating an object called network error. I'm creating an object called validation error. These are going to have custom properties, specifically the name for both of them. And then for the validation error, I've got a property called field where I can say, hey, you know what? It was the email field, or if it was the password field or the language field, this is the one that failed. So I created these custom errors just to be able to use them as part of my regular script. Now, what I'm saying here is I'm going to create my main app object. Waiting for DOM content loaded. I'm going to call my init script to bind some event listeners. So I'm going to listen for the form to be submitted. And then I'm going to do the validation. So in this file, this is the file that I'm using as part of my own application that I'm building. The errors, that's going to be something that I built myself, or maybe somebody else gave me that file. I'm going to be importing that. This is code that I didn't have to write for this project. It's something I can use in any project. The user file, also, I'm trying to make something here that can be reused. It's the type of thing that I would do with every form. Inside of here, I'm going to have the validation error. I'm importing that, so I've got access to that validation error. And then this one object that I'm exporting, user, I'm importing it here in my main script. What it's going to do is it's going to have these 3 functions inside of it. Submit. This is the one that I'm going to be calling from main.js. So every application that I build, I'm going to be calling this submit function. And right now the way it's structured is I'm asking for these parameters. So I'm saying there's 4 things you need to pass in, and you have to make sure you pass them in the right order. So this is sort of function 101. This is what you learn when you first start working with functions. You create parameters, you give them meaningful names, but there's a specific order that they have to be passed in. And that's what we're going to try to get away from with destructuring. I've got to validate. This is just a placeholder function. I can set this up so it's returned true or returned false. For every one of the things that I'm going to put into this module, let's say there was going to be validate password, and I had, so here's the password input. I'm going to pass that inside of here. I'm going to do some validation on that. Maybe there's a username field, maybe there's a language field. So for every one of these sort of common things that I would do validation on, I would add them in here, and then this is a file that I can bring into every one of my projects. Okay, so reuse. With modules, we're getting code reuse. Right here, we're going to apply the destructuring. Right now, what it does is it takes these 4 fields, and we could do validation on every one of them. So hey, if you've got a thing called email, right, if this wasn't null, then I'm going to call my validate function. If that returns true, we're good. If it returns false, that's what we're checking here. If it returns false, I'm going to throw a validation error. And it takes 2 things. One is the message, and one is the ID of the field. So if I pass in here, this is the input, a reference to the input element. I've got that here. I'm passing it to the validation. And if it failed, I'm going to get its ID. And because an ID is just a string, it allows me to pass it through the validation object back over to whatever page is calling this. So my main.js, that file was calling this submit function. We're going to be passing this back. And we do that by returning from this function, I'm returning a promise. And that's another thing that I'm doing here as a common functionality throughout this. Anytime I want to return from this, I'm always going to do it as a promise. That way I know I've got a sort of standard response. Here, I'm rejecting. Down at the bottom here, my upload, this is the last step. So if I passed all my validations, create some form data, I could put all of the fields into the form data and then pass the data, and the endpoint, which is another one of these parameters, I'm going to call this upload function that is inside my user script. I just have to pass in, hey, what page do you want to send it? Where is the script that's going to accept the form data? So again, this is making my file generic so I can get some reuse out of it. And all I return here is the fetch. So this is going to return a promise. Up here, I'm returning a promise. So this is a rejected promise. This one could be rejected or it could be resolved. So if the fetch works, we got resolved. If we have a network error, it's going to be rejected. Either way, we're always going to be sending back from here some sort of promise. So I'm saying return user upload. That's this function. This function is going to return the fetch. So the fetch is going to come from here, back up to here, and they get returned when we call user.submit. All right, back to our main script. We want to call that user submit function. Here's my init. I'm adding my listeners to the form. There's nothing really new worth talking about in there. Send. Here's my 4 variables that I'm going to send to my user script. So we call user.submit, and I pass in these 4 variables. Okay, fine, I pass it in. It's going to give me back either a rejected promise or the promise that's the fetch, which will resolve or reject. So the then or the catch, either one of these could work. Now this is where we want to put destructuring. This is where we want to improve this. We want to improve it in a way that makes it more usable and makes it more readable for developers. Right now, I'm passing in 4 things. What if I only passed in one thing? So I pass in some object. Over here, I'm going to receive one object. So if this were an object like that, instead of a whole bunch of individual parameters, now it's one thing, one object that's being passed in, and this is actually using destructuring. I'm getting the thing called email out of the object. I'm getting the thing called endpoint out of the object. I'm getting the thing called language out of the object. I'm getting the thing called password out of the object. And because it's destructuring, I don't have to put them in the same order. It doesn't matter what order I write them in, because destructuring takes the property. It actually does a search inside the object for something called email, pulls out the value and puts it into a variable called email. So we have that. I come back over here, and now this object that I'm going to pass in, don't have to call it obj, but I can just simply do this. And it doesn't matter what order I put them in. Now I can put this directly in here. I'm just doing the 2 steps so you can see that it is an object that I'm passing in. Just makes it a little bit easier to read. If my variables were called something else, let's say this one was called em, okay, fine. Then I want a parameter called email, and I'm going to put em inside of it. But if the name is the same, we can leave it just like that. Okay, so we've got something that's a little bit easier to read. We can see I've got an object. It's got the same 4 parameters. I'm passing it in. It's going over to here. It's being used. Now the order doesn't matter. I can see what I'm getting here. But the best thing is now I can change this script without worrying about breaking anything that I've got. What if I wanted to add a new feature? Now this is going to validate usernames. What if it's going to validate phone numbers? Something like that. I can now update this function right here. I can add in as many parameters as I want, and I can check for those things. I can say, the same way I did for email, I can come in here and say, you know what, if there's a username field, if something called username was passed in, if it's not, this is going to be undefined. So it won't pass this if. And then we can say, all right, if same sort of thing. We do this, and if it doesn't, we can return promise.reject, and the error is going to be one of these new validation ones. Getting more code reuse, failed username validation, and username.id. So whatever the field is, up here, this username field that got passed into here, here, we're going to use that HTML element and get its ID. I'm going to take the semicolon out of there. And we actually have to have this validate username function so we don't get an error. So whatever we want to have inside of here, return true or false, whatever it's doing. But we're just repeating this same pattern. And because I'm using destructuring, because I'm using an object here instead of just a series of named parameters, now it's one thing being passed in, and in the future I can add in as many more things as I want, as many new things as I want. And this is still not going to break any script that I wrote that used it. So I'm bringing in user just because I added something new into here. Maybe this was a common script that a whole bunch of other developers that I was working with, they're all using this thing. I haven't now broken their code by coming in here and throwing username at the front. The order doesn't matter. So inside of here, when we send something through, form validation error with email. So I'm getting a message coming back and I'm highlighting the field. So that last part right here, because we're able to do this, promise reject, I'm passing this error object, this validation error, that's being returned when we call submit. If we go back to our main script, down here, when we call this, we pass in that object, there was an error being returned, so it's going to jump down to the catch. And here's where I check for, was it a validation error? Was it a network error? If it was a validation error, I'm writing it in the console here, form validation error with error.field. So the error, that is that validation error object, it has a property called field. That's the one that we had back here in errors. There's field. This is the ID of the element on the page. So if I have the ID on the page, I can do this. Document get element by ID. That's the email field right here. And class list.add error. I'm writing this part. Me, the developer who's building the web page, I'm writing this. I'm writing the CSS, so I know what the name of my CSS class name is. In my CSS, down here at the bottom, I created a class. This is what I want errors to look like. I can do other things as well, but I know which field failed because when the script ran, user.submit, when that function ran, here was my test for some field that got passed in. This script doesn't care what it was. All it knows is here's a reference to some HTML input element, and it needs to have email validation done on it. That's all it knows, and that's all it cares about. I write the script here for my standard. It's probably going to be a regex validating against an email address. And make sure you do a trim before you do the regex on it. You want to make sure you get rid of spaces. I've actually come across a couple of websites in the last couple of weeks where I copied and pasted an email address, and because I had an extra space at the end of the email address when I pasted it in, it failed the validation. That's incredibly hard for a user to spot. You look at the email address, it looks fine, but it's telling you it's not a valid email address simply because they didn't do a trim to get rid of the extra space at the end before they did their pattern validation. So apparently .com space is not a valid ending for an email address, according to them. So these scripts, we want to make sure that we've got good validation in here. I'm going to build up a standard library of all the validation that I want to do, and that's all going to be in this file where I'm going to be doing testing against whatever fields I want now and in the future. So I can just keep updating this field and then reusing this one script. I'm exporting it so I can bring it into any project that I want. All right, so that is destructuring. When we call the function, we can do it like this with a variable, or we can just take the object itself like this and paste it right in here. That's going to work too. So I'm passing an object off to the function. The function is looking to receive one thing, an object. It doesn't matter what order the parameters are in. It uses destructuring to match them, and that's when it's going to run the rest of our script. This will always return a promise, so I know that I can use then catch to deal with the result that comes back. All right, so I hope that helps you out. Hope you can use these scripts as reference to help you in the future. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments. I'll answer as many as I have time for. If you found this helpful, please subscribe or share. And as always, thanks for watching.